They built a great empire with the blood and cries of children. Picture yourself standing in ancient Rome. The air is thick with the scent of freshly baked bread. The bustle of the marketplace hums around you, and the grand structures, marble columns, reaching for the sky surround you. The empire is in its prime, victorious, powerful, and brilliant. It's a time of triumph, of conquest, of culture. But behind the grandeur and the glory, there lies a story most would rather forget. For the next few minutes, I invite you to step into the shadows beyond the breathtaking architecture and noble statues and uncover a history that's rarely spoken of. It's the story of children, young boys, who were stolen from their homes, stripped of their innocence, and sold into lives of unimaginable suffering. These were not just any children, they were the prized possessions of the Roman elite, used for the whims of emperors, senators, and wealthy aristocrats. They were known as deliciae, or little delights, bought and sold not for labor, but for pleasure. It's hard to believe, isn't it? How could something so horrific have been hidden behind the walls of one of the greatest civilizations the world has ever seen? But the truth is, it happened. In the heart of Rome, amidst the splendor and luxury, there was a dark trade. A market where beautiful young boys were bought, groomed, and used by the wealthy for their entertainment. These children were not allowed to grow up. They were kept in a perpetual state of childhood, their bodies transformed into objects of beauty and submission. It may sound unbelievable, but it is true. And the most unsettling part, this isn't just a story from the distant past. It's a story that still echoes today. Human trafficking, exploitation, and the sexual abuse of children are not just remnants of history. They are ongoing crises that continue to affect millions of children around the world. The systems of power that once thrived in ancient Rome are still alive in today's society, masked in new forms, but with the same horrific consequences. In this video, we will walk through the gates of Rome, not to admire its monuments, but to uncover the darker truths that have been hidden in plain sight for centuries. We will examine the lives of these forgotten children, how they were exploited, and how their stories still resonate with the issues facing children today. Rome wrote the rules of civilization, yet broke the hearts of children to do it. Picture this: marble columns catching the first blush of sunrise senators, gliding past perfume fountains, and an emperor's banquet so lavish that peacock tongues are tossed aside like breadcrumbs. In the next 30 minutes, we'll peel back that postcard image and expose the chamber no tour guide mentions, the one where childhood was smothered beneath silk. Rome in AD 117 is the envy of the world. Its aqueducts pour fresh water across miles of stone desert. Its roads stretch farther than any mapmaker can ink. To the casual eye, the empire seems unstoppable progress carved in travertine. But every triumph has a shadow. Beneath those gleaming arches, a quieter procession files through side streets. At dawn, shackled boys' heads, shaved for auction eyes, still red from smoke and screams of conquered villages. The city calls them deliciae, little delights. History prefers to call them footnotes. We will call them by their rightful name, victims. If that sounds like ancient cruelty best left to dusty scrolls, consider this: by the time you finish watching this video, roughly 60 children around the world will be trafficked for labor or sex, an echo of Rome's darkest market still reverberating 2,000 years later. The curtain we're about to lift isn't just archaeology, it's a mirror. So let's walk together down the Via Sacra, past hawkers selling garum and figs, until we reach the forum's northeast corner. There, hidden behind a row of legal offices, is an unmarked doorway leading to the slave pens. No mosaics, no inscriptions, because nothing beautiful was meant to commemorate what happened inside. Yet that silence speaks volumes. Civilizations love to polish their victories and muffle their crimes. Tonight, we will refuse that silence. Over the next half hour, we'll trace the supply chains that fed Rome's hunger for perfect boys, crack open papyrus receipts that priced innocence in sesterces, and hear the faint voices of children erased from marble and memory. We'll test Roman law against Roman reality, weigh philosophy against profit, and follow the survivors, few as they were, into the uncertain daylight of manumission. Stay with me, because in shining a light on how the mightiest empire commodified childhood, we not only honor the forgotten, we gain a compass for judging our own age, and that compass points to an uncomfortable truth. Progress without compassion is just marble over rot. Ready, the markets are opening, the auctioneer's gavel is rising, and the story Rome tried to bury is about to speak. The Roman Empire was not built on marble alone. It thrived on bodies conquered, branded, and sold, and among them the most valuable were the smallest, the most delicate boys, whose beauty would be their curse. War fed the machine. When Roman legions raised their banners over distant lands, dark Dacian forests, the golden plains of Cappadocia, the incense-scented routes of Syria, they didn't just take gold or cattle, they took people. And within the tidy ledgers of logistics officers, boys were listed alongside grain and armor, categorized, priced, and tagged like precious cargo. At military depots known as statio cadaveriae, children were processed by traders, teeth checked, limbs measured, skin inspected for scars. The ideal boy between 9 and 13, pale-skinned, soft-featured, might be valued at 8,000 sesterces, the equivalent of more than $30,000 today. A garden slave cost a quarter of that. From there, the most promising stock was transported to the slave markets of Delos, the Aegean's human exchange. There, under striped awnings, buyers from Rome, Carthage, and Antioch bargained, while magistrates took their 2% tax. One surviving papyrus Pioxy, 42-3D-154, records the sale of a 12-year-old Syrian boy, musically trained, pleasing to look at, sold for over 10,000 sesterces, complete with insurance against storm or piracy. But the boy's value didn't end at Delos. He was loaded into a merchant caravan bound for Brundisium, and from there into the heart of the empire. Even the bureaucracy played its part. Boys like him were classified as merx nobilis, noble merchandise, and exempt from certain customs tariffs. Middlemen added 30 to 40% just for escorting them through the hills. A single summer campaign could generate over 3 million sesterces in human trafficking, enough to pave a new stretch of road or finance a senator's career. In the villas of Rome's elite, the demand only grew. It wasn't enough to have a beautiful child, they wanted exclusivity. Some aristocrats requested twin boys so alike he might never grow bored, as Juvenal once mocked. Castrated boys, despite the official ban, fetched even higher prices. What was mutilation to one became margin to another, and yet ledgers tell only part of the story. Behind each transaction was a child frightened, silent, stripped of name and past, a body repackaged as ornament, as status, as private pleasure. The trade routes flourished, but the fear in those boys' eyes was never documented, and the deeper question still waits. Once these boys were sold, what happened next? How were they shaped, styled, and silenced into submission? Who turned them into living decorations, trained to smile on command? Rome prided itself on being an empire of laws. There were laws for everything: how to build a house, how to bury the dead, how to divide farmland among sons. Legal codes were etched in bronze, studied by aristocratic children from an early age, and held up as the foundation of Roman civilization. But for the boys sold into sexual slavery, boys stripped of their childhood and locked behind gilded doors, those laws were nothing more than a cold, silent wall. Beautiful to look at, but without an entrance. In the eyes of the Roman state, these boys weren't people. They were property res, not persona. They had no right to love, no right to protection, no right to speak. They were listed in inventories beside stone benches, kitchenware, and bronze statues. If a master beat one to death, the courts didn't see murder. They saw financial loss. There was a law, the lex scantinia, which historians often point to as a rule meant to protect children. But in truth, it was designed to protect the dignity of freeborn Roman men, not enslaved boys. Abuse wasn't seen as wrong in itself, it was wrong only if it reached the wrong body. Even castration, officially banned under emperors like Domitian, was routinely practiced. In the slums of Subura underground, surgeons worked by torchlight, slicing away innocents in exchange for gold. If caught, they paid a fine. The profit for a castrated boy, often 10 times the price. And so in the court records that survive, we catch glimpses chilling in their simplicity. A boy named Heron, 13 years old, mutilated and thrown into the Tiber by his owner. The crime, not murder, but destruction of taxable property. Another boy, Faustus, escaped his master after repeated assaults, but the court ordered him returned with a gentle reminder. Try not to damage the merchandise. One wax tablet found in the ruins of Pompeii contains only a short sentence: return of runaway. Valuable. Do not mutilate. That was the closest thing to mercy. Even philosophers knew. Seneca, the tutor of Emperor Nero, once wrote, "We write laws in bronze and break them like clay." Yet even he, wise, eloquent, revered, never dared to challenge the institution of slavery. His words, like many, stopped just short of power. What Rome built was a theater of justice, precise, rehearsed, and blind to suffering. It could protect a senator's honor, a merchant's contract, a soldier's wage, but never a child's body. And for the boys trapped within this silent machine, the truth became painfully clear. Justice wears a robe, but never looks down. But if Rome refused to protect them, could the boys learn to protect themselves? In ancient Rome, to be born beautiful was never a blessing. For some boys, it marked the beginning of their undoing. Once purchased by the imperial elite, these children were not merely enslaved, they were transformed. Their journey led not to comfort, but into hidden rooms beneath aristocratic villas, or into the shadowed halls of the pedagogium, places, less like schools and more like workshops for erasing humanity. Here the making of a perfect boy began. The process started with the body. If the master demanded it, and many did, the child was subjected to castration. Despite being outlawed by Roman decree, it was common practice in secret. Underground surgeons, often untrained, used crude tools by candlelight. The objective wasn't just mutilation, it was preservation. The removal of future manhood meant keeping the boy's voice high, his skin smooth, his features soft. Puberty was seen as a threat to value. Death by blood loss was common, but for those who survived, their innocence was frozen in time at the price of their future. Then came the cosmetics. The boys were taught to adorn themselves with white powders made from lead rouge crushed from roses and dark kohl drawn beneath their lashes. Their skin was made paler, their lips redder, their eyes haunting. Every movement was practiced: how to walk, how to lower their gaze, how to bow without breaking the illusion of grace. They were bathed in goat's milk, perfumed with myrrh and oil, and trained to smile even when their hearts were breaking. They weren't allowed to speak freely, but they were expected to dazzle. Some masters took the transformation further with poison, not to kill, but to control. Small doses of opium were slipped into meals, calming the will. Herbs dulled their memory, their hunger, their anger. Sleep was induced not for rest, but for obedience. A boy who dreamed less resisted less. If one flinched or cried, he was reminded, others would die to be in your place. Gratitude was demanded even for pain, and so these children, some as young as 9, became ornaments. Silent, beautiful, controlled. They poured wine at Roman banquets with trembling fingers. They stood beside fountains as decoration. They learned to smile on command, to hide their terror behind painted lips. Their names were forgotten, their bodies altered, their souls buried beneath silk and scented oils. To the outside world, they were perfection, but inside something fragile still stirred, and in some of them that quiet stirring would grow into something that Rome could neither buy nor bury. Long before a boy stood beside a Roman noble dressed in silk and silence, he was broken methodically, completely within the walls of the pedagogium. From the outside, it resembled a school. Stone pillars, quiet courtyards, instructors dressed in white. But the lessons taught here had nothing to do with reading or reason. It was not a place for minds to grow. It was a place where spirits were softened, resistance shaved away like curls of marble, until what remained was obedient, beautiful, and hollow. The day began before dawn. A bell rang in the dark. The boys rose in silence. No words, no delay. Each step was rehearsed. They washed in cold water, their hands guided by older slaves. Their beds were inspected. If a wrinkle remained, punishment followed. Precision was the first lesson, because to serve the powerful, there could be no room for error. At sunrise, the training began. The boys were taught how to walk not too fast, not too slow, with feet never dragging and eyes lowered just enough to show reverence, but not shame. They learned to carry trays without sound, to bow with elegance, to pour wine without spilling a drop, even as hands trembled. Speech training followed. They repeated scripted phrases in soft, breathy tones. Yes, my lord. At your pleasure. I am yours. Any stutter earned a strike. Any question a stare of warning. Silence was rewarded. Smiles without voice. Presence without opinion. By midday, physical conditioning, not for strength but for posture. They balanced books on their heads, walked in tight circles for hours, hands raised or bound to correct slouching. Some fainted. They were revived. No one was allowed to fail. Then came private sessions. In small rooms, instructors taught the art of touch, how to flinch without showing it, how to stay still when afraid, how to smile through pain. Their bodies became rehearsed instruments trained to respond not by instinct, but by command. At sunset, they were perfume powdered and dressed not for comfort, but for presentation. Some were chosen to serve at private dinners. Others were sent to the baths where senators and merchants inspected their progress. Evening brought quiet, but never rest. They lay on hard cots, eyes open to the ceiling, trying to remember the sound of their mother's voices. Some wept, softly, into pillows that no longer smelled like home. One boy carved a name into the wood beneath his bed, a name he wasn't allowed to speak anymore, and still the bell would ring again. The next day would begin the same, with cold water, with perfect posture, with the slow death of childhood replaced by something Rome valued more, a silent, graceful, obedient ghost. But ghosts don't always stay silent. In the next chapter, one boy will be chosen to stand beside the emperor, not as a servant, not as a son, but as a wife. In Rome, violence did not always arrive on horseback. Sometimes it came in the form of a quiet invitation, handwritten on parchment, sealed with gold and delivered before sunset. A boy would be summoned, his hair freshly oiled, skin perfumed, tunic tightened at the waist. He was not going to war, he was going to dinner. But the feast was never truly about food. For the Roman elite, banquets were arenas of power where laughter masked cruelty and wine blurred the boundaries between amusement and assault. To command bodies was the ultimate luxury, and the younger, more delicate, and more voiceless, the victim, the greater the performance of control. At the center of these evenings stood boys from the pedagogium. Not guests, not servers, spectacles. They moved silently between silk-draped couches, pouring wine with hands trained not to tremble. Their gazes were kept low, their smiles rehearsed. They were chosen not just for their beauty, but for their silence. The guests noticed. They whispered. They wagered. And when the final toast was made, when plates lay bare and torches dimmed, some boys were told to stay behind. Their real purpose was about to begin. Behind closed doors, within walls painted with gods and heroes, a boy might be told to kneel, to undress, to obey, not as a lover, not even as a servant, but as a canvas onto which Rome's most powerful could project their darkest desires. There was no law to stop it. 2. Because Roman law did not recognize the rape of a slave as a crime. A boy's body was property owned, borrowed, or gifted. To violate it was not brutality, it was entitlement. One senator once wrote, "To tame a boy is to tame a kingdom." Another called it the wine of youth, sweetest when still, and the empire agreed. Some children were passed between nobles like coins. Others were kept hidden in villas outside the city, fed delicacies, clothed in silk, and expected to repay that kindness with complete submission. Even philosophers, men who spoke of virtue, penned verses about boys with limbs like ivory and tears that pleased the gods. Pain was poeticized, silence became a skill, and in the center of it all was power. Power that demanded beauty, then crushed it. Power that cloaked violence in ritual and called it culture. But power can never fully erase memory. One boy remembered, not just the banquets, not just the pain, but the man who chose him and renamed him. In the shadows of Rome's power, resistance didn't always roar. Sometimes it was nothing more than a flicker, a brief, almost imperceptible refusal to bow, a whispered refusal to disappear completely. For most of the boys stolen from their homes, survival meant obedience. Every day they learned to bend without breaking, to please without feeling. They wore the chains with grace, smiled through their suffering, and performed their roles as perfect possessions until the day they could no longer bear it. But even in the darkest corners of the empire, there were those who ran. There are stories, faint but powerful, of boys who escaped their master's control. The records are sparse, but they exist buried beneath layers of indifference and fear. Boys who, despite being trained to please, found the courage to flee. One such boy, known only as the Wanderer, slipped through the cracks of his owner's lavish villa in the dead of night, weaving his way through the streets of Rome. His escape was discovered the next morning, but by then he was already lost to the city. His name vanished from records, but for a brief moment he was free. For many, the consequences of running were brutal. Those who were caught were punished not just for attempting to escape, but for daring to reclaim the one thing they had been taught to never own: their own bodies. Some were branded with marks of ownership that would last forever. Others were sold to more distant masters, to places where escape would be nearly impossible. But not all stories ended in despair. Occasionally there was the rare success, a boy who after years of submission found a way out. Some after years of obedience were granted their freedom, but even that came at a cost. Freedom was never truly freedom in ancient Rome. Former concubines, those freed by their masters or through some twist of fate, often faced a life marked by shame and stigma. They were free in name, but the world would never look at them the same way. Some of them went on to live quiet lives, taking up the humbling work of artisans or farmers. But even in their new lives, their scars, both physical and psychological, remain. One of the most famous cases of this rare freedom was that of Lucius, a boy who had once served in the palace of a high-ranking Roman senator. After years of servitude, Lucius was granted manumission upon his master's death. However, his freedom did not bring peace. Lucius, haunted by his past, traveled across the empire, but his old master's name followed him. Despite his new life, despite his newfound freedom, he was never seen as anything more than a former possession. His story is one of survival, but it's also one of loss, a poignant reminder that freedom is never complete for those who have been broken by the system. Yet for every boy who faded into history, there were those who fought back in ways large and small. In ancient Rome, the collision of faith, philosophy, and the law created a world where the powerful were allowed to shape the truth to suit their needs. For those who were forced into submission, these ideologies became weapons, both the shield and the sword used to keep them in line. Rome prided itself on being a civilized empire, one that upheld reason, law, and virtue. But the philosophy that defined this grand civilization often failed its most vulnerable members, those it deemed mere property. The Stoics spoke of inner freedom, of finding strength in adversity, but these ideals did little to protect the children whose bodies were sold sculpted and destroyed by those very men who espoused such high ideals. The philosophers of Rome, men like Seneca, Epictetus, and even Marcus Aurelius, spoke of virtues such as patience, endurance, and control over one's desires. They taught that true power came from mastering oneself, from choosing the right action, even in the face of overwhelming pressure. But these lessons, while wise, were lost on the boys trapped in the emperor's bedchamber. The ideal of a life led by reason and virtue only seemed to exist for those in power. It was a system of thought built to justify control, to make the powerful feel noble in their oppression. The wise man is the master of his own desires, they wrote. But for the boys who had no say in their bodies, this philosophy rang hollow. In fact, much of Rome's legal and moral code came from this very philosophy. But as with all systems of power, it was rigged to protect the interests of the powerful. Roman law was designed to maintain the status quo, where the wealthy had the right to possess others, not only as labor, but as ornaments, as things that could be touched and broken with no consequence. But there were some who, despite everything, sought solace in the gods. Despite being forced to serve the desires of men, some of the boys turned to the divine for their only remaining form of resistance, faith. As Christianity began to spread across the empire, many slaves and concubines found comfort in the new religion. For them, the message of eternal life and salvation became a lifeline, a way to escape the degradation of their earthly existence. But this faith was not without its contradictions. Christian leaders too turned a blind eye to the plight of the young boys who served Rome's elite. Though the church condemned sexual immorality, it largely ignored the reality of slavery, especially the sexual exploitation of children. There is a striking passage from the early Christian theologian Augustine, who wrote about the corruption of human desire. "The soul is poisoned by the pleasures of the flesh," he said. This idea, echoed throughout the writings of early Christian fathers, justified the systemic oppression of the very children who were being abused. Christianity offered a spiritual escape, but it did little to change the material conditions that perpetuated their suffering. But there was for some an internal rebellion, a recognition that something was wrong. For those who managed to escape, those rare souls who found a way to break free of their chains, faith became more than a survival mechanism. It became a form of defiance. It was not only a way to cope with suffering, but also a means to reclaim their dignity, to remember that they were not just property, but human beings, bodies and souls deserving of more than to be used, abused, and forgotten. History, like a grand mosaic, often pieces together the past through the lens of the victors. The art, the poetry, the monuments, they are all shaped by those who remain in power. And so the story of the boys who were made into delights of Rome was never truly told. For centuries, their suffering was reduced to nothing more than faint whispers, footnotes buried under layers of romanticism, political convenience, and historical amnesia. The grand narrative of Rome, with its columns and conquests, has long overshadowed the stories of those it crushed beneath its gilded feet. And in the art that shaped our understanding of that time, their pain was painted over with the gloss of nobility. One need only look at the works of the 19th century Romantic artists to see this whitewashing. John William Waterhouse's Hylas and the Nymphs, or Lawrence Alma Tadema's idyllic scenes of Roman baths, where naked youths swim among tranquil waters, their bodies sleek and glorified, show nothing of the brutality that lay beneath those serene surfaces. These artists, in their brilliant hues, created an image of a Rome bathed in beauty and harmony, while the true horrors of its private chambers remained hidden in the shadows. These paintings, lauded as masterpieces, obscured the lives of the very boys they depicted. What was once the reality of their lives, a constant cycle of sexual exploitation, psychological torment, and physical transformation, was buried under the lens of classical beauty. They were not seen as children of trauma, but as objects of desire idealized in ways that allowed those in power to look away without guilt. Even literary works and historical narratives from the period often obscured or ignored the exploitation. Suetonius, in his Lives of the 12 Caesars, mentions the relationships of emperors like Nero and Hadrian with young boys. Antinous, one of the most famous, was canonized as a god after his mysterious death. But what was the reality of his relationship with Hadrian? Was it love, as later scholars would romanticize, or was it the extreme disparity of power? Antinous, like so many others, became a symbol of desire, not a victim of manipulation and control. Even modern scholars have contributed to this oversight. For much of the 20th century, the study of Roman history focused on the glory, the triumphs of empire, the gods and goddesses, the legacies of emperors, the slaves, the eunuchs, the children whose suffering paved the way for Rome's splendor, were relegated to the margins of study. Historians themselves, often removed from the realities of abuse, sanitize these stories, treating them as cultural differences rather than human rights violations. It wasn't until the late 20th century that historians began to lift the veil and truly question the portrayal of ancient Roman life. Scholars from the feminist movement, from post-colonial studies, and from historical psychology began to investigate the darker undercurrents of Roman life, challenging the glorified accounts and demanding the recognition of the system that commodified children. Yet even now, there remains a blind spot in how we understand the past. The romanticized image of ancient Rome persists, especially in popular culture. Films, television shows, and books continue to glamorize Rome's decadence, while the reality of its abuse is relegated to the periphery. The Hollywood effect, from movies like Gladiator to Spartacus, depicts a world where men rise and fall, but rarely acknowledges the silent suffering of those whose bodies were used to build Rome's empire. In a world that still traffics in power, beauty, and exploitation, the story of these boys is not just an ancient one. It is ongoing. The echoes of history are not as far behind us as we like to think. The marble columns of Rome may have crumbled, its emperors and senators long turned to dust, and the empire's vast territories reduced to ancient ruins. But the shadows it cast, the darkness of exploitation, power, and cruelty still linger in the modern world. What happened to those boys sold and exploited in the markets of Rome, turned into living possessions for the whims of the powerful, is not a story confined to the annals of ancient history. It is still happening today. The systems of power and control that existed in ancient Rome have evolved, but they have not disappeared. The child trafficking crisis that plagues our world today is eerily similar to the horrors inflicted upon children in ancient Rome. The parallels are shocking but undeniable. In ancient Rome, boys were trafficked, bought and sold in slave markets valued not for their humanity, but for their beauty and obedience. They were seen as objects to be used for the pleasure of their masters, no different than the most expensive trinkets or rare gems. These children were groomed, transformed, and silenced just as children are today. Today, human trafficking is a global industry, and children make up a significant portion of those sold. They are trafficked for sexual exploitation, forced labor, and even illegal adoptions. In the same way that Rome commodified the bodies of young boys, modern society continues to commodify children, treating them as property rather than as human beings with rights and voices. In 2020, the United Nations estimated that 1 million children were trafficked across international borders for sexual exploitation and forced labor. Much like in Roman times, these children are bought and sold in markets that exist in dark corners of the internet and underground trade networks. Their lives are stolen, their bodies are used, and their futures are erased. The methods may have changed, but the core principles of exploitation remain the same. Powerful individuals continue to exploit the vulnerable. Children like the ones in ancient Rome are considered commodities valued only for their ability to serve and please those with the means to buy them. The Roman Empire's slave markets, which trafficked children for the pleasure of the elite, are no different from the modern trafficking networks that span the globe today. The systems that sustain them are disturbingly similar. Poverty, war, and power fuel the trade, while society's indifference and ignorance allow it to persist. In ancient Rome, the moral blindness that allowed such atrocities to continue was rooted in the belief that some lives were worth less than others, that those born into servitude had no inherent value. And today we still see that same dehumanization reflected in the way society views trafficked children. They are often dismissed as runaways or willing participants, as though their suffering is somehow deserved or self-inflicted. This same narrative was used in ancient Rome to justify the abuse of slave boys. Their pain was ignored, their suffering was minimized, and their stories were forgotten. Modern society, with all its advances, has not fully broken free from these same blind spots. The story of Rome's forgotten boys is not just ancient history, it is a warning. And the steps we take today will determine if history repeats itself or if we as a society choose to break the cycle and create a future where children are never again treated as property.